All right, this session now, this afternoon, we're going to give our Chinese guests a rest. You have done a wonderful job for us this morning. You really teed it up, and you deserve it. We want to try to turn now to a group of American friends and colleagues and get some reactions. Not just, but primarily, but first and foremost to what was said this morning, but then also to their long and deep involvement in these questions of U.S.-Asian and U.S.-China relations. I'm not going to introduce the members. Their bios are available to you in the program, but thank you all for being with us. Michael Swain, I was trying to see Michael during the lunch hour, but he was so busy talking to reporters, I never got through to him. But we're just very pleased to have them here. I thought I'm going to try to organize the session in terms of three areas where I thought we had some interesting discussion this morning and we can get reactions to it and elaborate on it. One is I want to come back to the security dilemma. I want to come back to the discussion about the security dilemma. Ask our American panelists what they heard, what troubled them, what encouraged them, because I had the sense that maybe we still haven't grasped the nettle of the security dilemma in U.S.-China security relations. And that nettle is not capabilities. The idea that China is going to continue to acquire capabilities is, I think, baked in the cake. And despite American difficulties and problems, we're not about to disappear militarily in the Asia region. So the question really is about intentions. It's about what other countries think about what you're doing. What do other countries, and in this case the United States, think about what you, China, is doing? Or what do you, China, think about what the United States is doing? So it's a question of reassuring other neighbors and partners that, in fact, your acquisition of capabilities is not intended to harm them, but simply to protect you. Now, this is a fundamental problem in international affairs, and it's going to affect U.S.-China relations. So we want to spend a little more time on that topic. Secondly, I think we want to look at something which was maybe not mentioned explicitly this morning, but it was apparent in much of what was said. We want to look at the underlying bargain that has shaped U.S.-China relations for the last 35 years, and could be in the process of being called into question. And that bargain is that the United States has said, listen, we're going to welcome you on board in terms of your participation in the world economy. We're going to facilitate that so that you can become stronger and wealthier, benefiting from the globalization that has made Western countries so powerful and so dynamic. But we hope in response that you're not going to oppose the system that essentially nurtures that world economy, and that you're not going to create conflicts. And moreover, that maybe in the process you might become more transparent, more open, more accessible to us and to others. Now that sounds, I've framed it sort of very favorably from the standpoint of the United States. But one thing I want to say, and I want to put this on the table because I want to get our Chinese guests to react to it in their last panel. Whatever you say about American policy, and I think there's plenty of reason to wonder about what America is doing, and especially militarily around the world, you have to concede that America has built not self-built, but led an economy, a world economy, that has welcomed competitors. One country after the other has been welcomed into the international economic system, by the way, in large part into the American consumer market, because we've provided a lot of the pull of consumption that has fueled that world economy over the last 40, 45 years. That you have to, I think, that's part of in that way, I should say, in that way, America has reassured other countries, including, we hope, China, about our intentions. And so we need to kind of put that on the table and ask to the question then, as China rises in power and maybe even dominates ultimately in the region, we don't know where that's going, what kind of a world is China going to superintend, or is going to, will China lead? Lastly, I think we want to come back to the basic question about what's happening domestically in both countries. The fact that, in fact, in both countries, growth is slowing, maybe a good deal less in China than in the U.S., but we face some serious problems internally in the United States. Resources are not going to be as available as they were before. What's this decline of resources and this, therefore, sort of greater inward preoccupation that will necessarily follow from declining resources? What will it mean for the relationship between the two countries? So with that as framework, let me just turn to the panelists. We'll just start. Michael, we'll start with you over closest to the platform. And just ask you, what did you hear this morning in the discussion about the security dilemma that was noteworthy, troubling, encouraging? What would you like to say in response to that conversation that we heard among our Chinese friends about the security dilemma?
Can I stay seated, or do I have to stand up?
I think seated. Seated is correct. Yeah.
Okay. Done? All right. Well, I was really fascinated by the remarks that were made by the Chinese participants on many of the issues. I think they were very frank. I think they were very reflective. They sounded very honest in their views about some issues that really are, frankly, very controversial within China, I think. And that's all very sort of in itself reassuring in some ways, that there are people who are seriously looking at the problems that China is looking at today, and they understand the issues that they're creating both for China and for outside powers. And the main, I guess, themes that I took away from the presentations are one, that indeed China has many problems to deal with. Many of them are domestic. This situation is unlikely to change anytime in the foreseeable future. In fact, it could get worse. But they weren't overly pessimistic about that. They were very optimistic about the ultimate ability of China to sustain adequate growth rates, to maintain order, stability, and a level of prosperity in the society that would be useful for China and for the world. The second thing that I found very interesting is that they really came back to this over and over again, that there's a lot of debate. A lot of the critical issues are not resolved. There's an increasing amount of debate and maybe even contention over some very fundamental issues of Chinese foreign policy, as well as, I guess, to some extent, Chinese domestic policy, but it was mainly with reference to foreign policy. And the implication, well, it was actually explicitly stated that given these two factors and China's limited capabilities, China's overall orientation towards the outside world as a foreign policy actor is essentially defensive and reactive. I mean, much of the characterization of the major disputes that we've seen in recent years that have been labeled by many as a more assertive China, if you will, were couched by the Chinese panelists this morning very much as reactions to what other people were doing, which tended to imply that if they stop doing these things, we won't have any problems. And I guess that is one area where I begin to sort of, if you talked about problems or questions, where I begin to question exactly whether that is the case and to what degree, because many people I have spoken with, at least in the U.S., who look at this problem very carefully, including both military and non-military people, see that China is both reacting to actions of others, but at the same time it is attempting to, in the process of reacting, it is changing the status quo, and it is doing it deliberately in the Western Pacific. And it's doing it in part by having greater presence, by relying on a much greater capacity to deploy military and non-military entities of different types out into areas that are very disputed. And it is doing that in order to set a new status quo, which is that China has administrative presence. And we see that in the case of the East China Sea now, to do with the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands. And it's created a new threshold, if you will, to which other countries have to react themselves. And the potential for this to continue in the absence of a more reliable and binding code of conduct, at the very least, about how you deconflict these increased presence, these increased numbers of actors out there doing things. In the absence of that, I'm very concerned that we're going to see more and more severe types of crises occurring over these maritime territorial disputes and resource disputes. And they could get even more intense if people actually begin discovering resources out there that were bigger than expected, let's say. And we don't have a clear way of dealing with that right now. Either the actors themselves don't, and the U.S. makes cautionary statements from the sidelines, which are interpreted alternately as backing this or that individual, this or that actor. And it's very questionable in my mind as to whether or not that is going to be enough to contribute to a longer-term basis or a more stable equilibrium going forward. But I have other points that I could make about what this says about the broader situation that the U.S. and China face in the region, but maybe I'll hold off on that since I don't want to monopolize.
Okay. Michael, thank you. No, right on the mark. Mike Green.
Well, you invited 3 of China's best and brightest, and I see you have 4 Americans to match 3 Chinese.
That's what it takes.
It takes 2 Michaels to take on 1 Shending Li.
We'll see the other one in a minute.
I thought more about the panel as I listened to Jane Harman at lunch. And when she said the administration has not done a good job explaining its Asia strategy or explaining the pivot, that's exactly what I was thinking as I was listening to the panel this morning. And I think one of the critical things President Obama has got to do on this trip and in the future is provide a context for our strategy in Asia. It's been piecemeal and it's been reactive. The initial joint statement with President Hu in 2009 sent one signal, mostly of accommodation. The pivot sends another signal. The strategic guidance signed by the president sent a military signal. And I've worried about this. I know Dan and others have. And I heard this morning quite sophisticated observers of the world scene. And I thought they're confused about what our strategy is. And that's not good. So, and perhaps our own government is. So that's one reaction I had. I would briefly, though, on Congresswoman Harman's really excellent lunch talk, I have to parenthetically say one thing. The United States is not neutral on the issue of the Senkaku. We are neutral on the territorial question, but with respect to our security treaty obligations to Japan, we're not neutral. And I just thought that's important for those who are new to this issue to appreciate. The other thing is, you mentioned, Henry, about the security dilemma. So I also thought the discussion of the security dilemma was interesting, and I felt this for some time. Deng Li's colleague, Wu Jinbo, and I are doing a book chapter together on the security dilemma, and I think this is an area we need a lot more discussion. So what I heard from the Chinese panelists was a multifaceted description of China's security challenges with a focus on the domestic concerns, which I think is accurate. But I also heard a caricaturization of the security dilemma that for the most part sounded to me like sorry for the academics, but what you would call a structural realist's definition of the security dilemma. In other words, the dilemma is created by shifts in the balance of power, and that's all. So John Mearsheimer, for example, thinks conflict is inevitable because of power distributions. And it ignores very important dimensions of international relations, which put this security dilemma problem in a different perspective. One is what Henry mentioned, which is intentions matter. I think the security dilemma would be less acute if the United States and other countries did not think or did not worry that China's stance in these territorial disputes involves coercion. Yes, to some extent, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Japan have complicated the diplomacy with their domestic politics or some of their moves. But particularly in the South China Sea, China is by far the more powerful country. So as the U.S. or other countries think about how China will use its power, intentions matter, and I think the reason for increased friction in the relationship with China, not just from the U.S. but from many countries in the region, is because of intentions and questions about how China intends to use its power, and that you cannot capture if you talk about something like the Scarborough issue in a historical Philippine-China bilateral context. The Philippines are weak. And the rest of the region views how a powerful China treats a weak Philippines, and don't think of it in terms of what's fair and unfair, or what's historically the record. Now, China has its own policy and its own interests, and will decide what it wants to do. But as you think about the security dilemma, it's important to think about intentions, and it's especially important to recognize how attitudes towards weaker parties are interpreted by larger parties, whether it's Japan or the United States. Second dimension. I ask my students at Georgetown, some of whom are here, the question, does the United States need preeminence in Asia? Do we need to be the most powerful country in material terms? Or do we need our interests to be secured? The prosperity of our people, safety of our allies, open access, international liberal system preserved. And the students have a healthy debate, and some of them are here, and it's going to be on the final exam. So, listen carefully.
Don't give it away. No.
And it's a debate, but I think if you look historically at the rise of American power and of Britain, I don't think that went peacefully because we are culturally related. The U.S. was planning wars against Britain up until 1941. I think it worked because the U.S. system was open, transparent, and Lord Palmerston in London concluded the American rise was going to preserve the system Britain needed. So it's an interesting question. Maybe the other American panelists want to comment. I personally don't think absolute American material dominance and material power is our goal. I think our goal is a system that protects interests that lie elsewhere. We're not anywhere near that, but that puts China in a different perspective. When President Obama says the U.S. has a stake in China's success, when Condoleezza Rice told Jiang Zemin when I was there, we don't fear a strong China necessarily, I think these are sincere. And then the third thing briefly is, I think in our U.S.-China discussions of the security dilemma, we tend to underplay the role of third parties. Japan, India, Australia, Korea, Indonesia, these are proud, also nationalistic states. And they don't, as someone said earlier, except maybe for Japan, they don't want to have to choose between the U.S. and China. Even Japan doesn't. And that, to me, is reassuring, because they're gonna push China back when China's too assertive, and they're going to use us to do it. But frankly, if we're too assertive, they're going to push us back. And I think these middle powers, who collectively represent a serious force in Asian international relations, get a vote, and that, I think, on balance, if we take them seriously, is going to have a positive effect on how the U.S. and China view our own potential security dilemma, because they don't want one. And we both value our relationship with them. In fact, in some ways, they're the focus of our competition. And that, on balance, may be a healthy thing if we look at it the right way.
Excellent. Good. Great. Thank you. Ted.
I was both pleased and somewhat surprised at the extent of the diversity of views expressed by our Chinese scholars this morning. I find that incredibly encouraging, because I think that's an essential precondition, a foundation, if you will, for a more open policy community, a more open political system in China. And so this is an extremely positive development. It also highlights, I think, the danger often engaged in by international relations scholars as viewing great powers in binary terms, either as status quo powers or revisionist powers. I think the system certainly is much more complex than that. I would not regard China as a status quo power, but it's certainly not an aggressive or radical revisionist power in the way that Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, or the Soviet Union were. China, I think, is more properly described as a cautious revisionist power. It's not willing to accept the status quo, which was largely designed by the United States and the Western powers after World War II, but it wants to adjust or tweak that system to the benefit of China, not overturn it. And that is a very, very important distinction, both globally and in terms of the relationship between the United States and China. I would caution also against falling into the trap of a binary interpretation, even at a secondary level. This morning in the discussion about the reasons for the U.S. Rebalancing or strategic pivot to Asia, and there was a discussion among the panelists, basically two schools of thought in China about the motives. One motive being that East Asia was simply more important for the United States than ever before, and that is the primary reason for the rebalancing. The less generous interpretation is that this is a thinly disguised containment policy directed against China. I would argue that these are not mutually exclusive concepts. East Asia is increasingly important to the United States. This is a trend that has now been going on for several decades. But if one judges Washington's actions, not just its rhetoric, it's a little hard to conclude that an implicit containment policy directed toward China is not at least part of the motivation. And I would place that in that larger context. You have to take into account that the announcement of the rebalancing occurred at the same time that the United States was injecting itself to a much greater extent than before into the maritime disputes in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and doing so in a way that quite clearly seemed to tilt against China, despite all the proclamations of neutrality in terms of substance. One cannot ignore, again, that larger context of Secretary of Defense Panetta's visit to Cameron Bay with the South China Sea as a backdrop to his speech, and emphasizing the need to protect the rights of all parties in the South China Sea, following on the heels of speeches by Secretary of State Clinton and President Obama, respectively in the Philippines and in Australia, clearly indicating backing for those countries. Again, look at that larger context. The U.S. seems to take a position on the dispute over the islands, both in the East China Sea, of being quite friendly to the claims of various powers except for China. And the U.S. officials may claim all they wish with regard to the Diaoyu Senkaku dispute, that we have a posture of neutrality on the substance of the dispute. But when we simultaneously say that those islands are included within the mutual defense treaty between the United States and Japan, implicitly we are regarding those islands as Japanese territory. We are prejudging the issue, as much as our officials might insist otherwise. So when you look at the rebalancing, the strategic pivot in that larger context, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that a containment policy is at least one element of that rebalancing. Finally, I would say that it's important to really re-emphasize a theme that came up several times in the morning panels and was emphasized by Representative Harman at lunch, and that is the need for respect. And in this, I think the biggest policy change needs to come from the United States. There are too many occasions where, when there is a policy disagreement involving China, for that matter, involving other countries, U.S. officials do not show respect. Our diplomacy too often consists of a laundry list of demands without much in the way of reciprocity. And even the tone often leaves a lot to be desired. I'm thinking in particular of the reaction of U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Susan Rice and Secretary of State Clinton regarding China and Russia with respect to policy towards Syria and Iran. The policy towards Syria, where Ambassador Rice asserted that the actions of Beijing and Moscow on this issue were shameful Secretary Clinton, I believe, used the term despicable and accused both China and Russia of having no consideration for the welfare, for the rights of the Syrian people. It's one thing to have a policy disagreement, and clearly that is warranted in many cases. It is not proper conduct to engage in that kind of inflammatory rhetoric. And I believe that both Ambassador Rice and Secretary Clinton need to have remedial courses in diplomatic language. And last, I'm wary of getting involved in the debate about capabilities versus intentions. Both are important, but a number of national security scholars and historians have pointed out over the years that capabilities certainly can change. They can grow or decline over time. Intentions can change, and sometimes very rapidly. So that if you're going to establish a hierarchy, one probably needs to pay more attention to capabilities rather than intentions. Does country X have the capability to really harm U.S. interests if it chooses at some point in the future to do so? I don't, again, want to get into a binary perspective on that, but I think if one has to choose between the two, I would focus more on capabilities than intentions. Those are likely to change more slowly than intentions do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dan?
Sure. You want us to stick on the security dilemma?
Yes, initially, please.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just say one thing about capabilities versus intentions. You know, arguing about whether China is going to have greater capabilities and greater ambitions and intentions is like arguing whether a tiger is going to grow teeth or claws. I mean, every great power, including us, and I'm sure we looked very scary. Very scary to many of the Caribbean nations when we were growing as a power. Every great power gets more power, has more interests, and has more ambition. So I look at it less as a security dilemma, although there are elements of it there, and more as a conflict of interests and ideologies. And that is the tragedy of great power politics. I don't agree with everything in the book, but there's not going to be a China exception to great power rises. I mean, I think the burden of proof would be on anyone who claims that there is. In terms of security dilemmas, well, I think Dr. Dingley Shun stated a number of interests and a prism through which those interests are seen in China. He stated sovereignty, territorial integrity, integration of territories that China claims, the protection of China's own traditions, the protection of the one-party state as interests. And then he mentioned that China is not going to be a victim anymore, so there's the perception that I read. This is, you know, through the lens of history and through the lens of ideas, that China was once a victim but is now powerful and won't be a victim anymore. The U.S., on the other hand, has very different interests, and I don't know how you know, besides with some very sophisticated statecraft, and I wouldn't get into the containment engagement argument, because containment is a term of art very specific to the Soviet Union, which was an autarkic nation. So we're actually actively trying to keep it down and impose costs upon it. I do agree with Ted Carpenter that ever since we started in this business, you could say 1992, 1993, until now, we have been containing China's expansive military actions as we've been engaging them. So I think Mike Swain signed on to a paper called Congagement. I'm not sure if he did or not, and Rand, but many of his colleagues did, and that's been the policy. It's been the policy since Bill Clinton upgraded the relationship with Taiwan and with Japan. It's been the policy since, and then went ahead and got China into the World Trade Organization. It's been the policy since Bush made the deal he did with India. It's been as he also expanded or started the now SCED. So there are elements of contain. You know, the Chinese often say, "Are you trying to contain us. We're afraid of your containment. Well, the truth is they should be scared of our containment because we are trying to contain them, and it to some degree. And again, not to they're part of the international system, so we'd like them to evolve in a way that they become a more constructive part of the international system. But that's again that's the American point of view, and that gets to conflicts of interest rather than security dilemmas. In terms of real conflicts of interest, so Shundong Li mentioned a number of them. In terms of China's interests, the U.S. interests, and this goes to Mike Green's question regarding primacy, preeminence versus just your interests being met. And I think the U.S. has interests in maximum wealth, maximum security, maximum autonomy, maximum liberty because we're a creedal nation. We can't help ourselves. And some of the things that Ted Carpenter chastised the secretary about, I'll be diplomatic about this, is we're never going to stop doing that. I mean, we as a nation, ever. I mean, we elected, President Obama came into power in many ways as a, quote, non-ideological president. Well, he went into Libya for humanitarian reasons because he said that's what we do as a people. China reads this as a very dangerous move and can't quite understand that we do things sometimes on purely humanitarian bases. And I can see why that would be very threatening to China, for all the reasons Shundong Li and others raised out. So I don't know how you get around. We're a very ideological nation. We were created based on an ideology, and I think some of our Chinese friends pointed out China's basic ideology. Whether it's ideas about the history and how to redress the grievances of the past, whether it's ideas about one-party rule and how to make that one-party rule safe in a world in which there aren't many one-party states left. I think we have conflicts rather than security dilemmas.
Henry?
Okay, interesting. Whoops, sorry.
About the security dilemma, I never really addressed that.
Oh, all right. You want to say something further about it?
I didn't say anything about it. But.
Okay. All right. Let me tee it up in just this way. What's the most important thing you think the United States could do? What would be the most important initiative that the United States might be able to take to begin to address what are clearly different assessments of the security relationship, whether we call it a dilemma, whether we focus on the capabilities or the intentions? I mean, there's clearly a lot of room here for misunderstanding about what each country is doing. So the question is, we support humanitarian relief in Libya, and China sees that as some kind of a threat. China is dealing with what it believes to be its fishing rights in the East and South China Sea, and we see that as a threat, or the Philippines see that as a threat. So what's the most important thing we could do? I'll start with you, Michael, and you can address anything else you want to address about the security dilemma. By the way, I might just add, Congresswoman Harman gave us some ideas. She talked about more cooperation in joint disaster relief in the region. Clearly, more discussions about security policy, more openness about our security planning and our defense planning, and so on. Yes, Michael.
Okay. I'll try and be really brief on the security dilemma question. And people have touched on aspects of this. But to my mind, the basic security dilemma in the U.S.-China relationship is focused on the Western Pacific. And it has to do with, there's a variety of factors that fuel it. But the most important underlying aspect of it, which is the kind of context within which the countries operate, is their assumptions about what best serves stability and prosperity in that part of the world. Now, you can point to a whole range of different policies and issues on which the United States and China agree about the need to have peaceful environment, the need to have negotiation, the need to avoid conflict, the need to have essentially market-oriented economic system. I mean, big change there. There's a lot of areas where you can agree that the two sides really share their notion of what the region should look like. But if you're looking at what are the larger structural, if you will, conditions under which you can maximize those common objectives, I think that the United States and China have an increasingly differing view about this. I think the United States view is essentially that in the maritime reaches of the Western Pacific, continuing stability and prosperity in a very changing and uncertain environment rests largely with the ability of the United States to sustain what it regards as its leadership role, which to me comes down to, in the political area, you can basically understand what that means, trying to lead the way in developing joint and common solutions to a range of political problems and a range of economic problems, etc. In the military sphere, I think that this comes down to a basic assumption that stability and prosperity in Asia are best served by the United States remaining predominant in that part of the world. And what does that mean? That means over any major kinds of disputes that the U.S. might want to address as part of its national interests, it will have the capability to prevail in any kind of contingency that might arise. It will have the ability to control escalation. It'll have the ability to deter the other side by being able to clearly prevail and win in any kind of a conflict that might emerge, even involving other powers and not necessarily the U.S. if the U.S. feels it's related to the U.S.'s own interests. So it's not just about interests in the narrow sense of the word. It's about how you conceive of an environment that best promotes your interests. And along with that goes all the talk about, cooperation, dialogue, multilateral this, multilateral that, positive sum thinking, but you strip all that away and you're left with a basic assumption about how the power structure should work, at least in the most fundamental area, which is military capabilities. And the Chinese, I think, ultimately don't accept this, particularly in the Western Pacific, and particularly along their maritime periphery. And their ability to acquire more capabilities that are designed specifically to complicate the ability of the United States to freely operate in that part of the world is perceived by many in the U.S. as a threat. It's not necessarily an intentional threat, we're going to go out and get you, because the Chinese think of this as deterrence, counter-intervention over Taiwan or something like that. But that in itself, and here we get to, this is the capabilities question, that in itself is perceived as a threat because it is seen as, to the U.S., because it's seen as providing the basis for the Chinese government then perhaps engaging in activities that it wouldn't otherwise do. Putting pressure on Taiwan, putting pressure on Japan, putting pressure in the South China Sea using coercion. So the uncertainty of that changing notion or that differing notion of what the best power structure is lies at the basis for the kinds of uncertainties and suspicions, rather, that the two countries have towards each other. And then when you add on to that the fact that you have two very different political systems that look at one another as to a certain degree threatening because of the nature of those systems. And Aaron Friedberg, I think, takes that up to the nth degree. He thinks that is the issue. I don't think it's the issue. But I do think it contributes to it. And then if you add to that the legacy of the Second World War, which is, we see this played out today over the Diaoyu Senkaku's issue. 70 years after the end of that war, you still have a theme that resonates in China in particular of an image of Japan that is rooted in that experience. And I would argue to some degree has been encouraged by the Chinese government for decades. And that kind of a mindset makes it extremely difficult to come into this more kind of flexible, even-handed, open kind of approach to dealing with these kinds of problems. And I'm not excusing the Japanese for having done things that don't serve their own interests as well. But unless the Chinese government can get a better handle on how it conveys its image and how it's interpreting other people within the region, in ways that can affect the Chinese public. And all of our Chinese panelists talked about that this morning and saw that as a shortcoming for the Chinese government. It's failure to really bring the Chinese people along in areas that serve China's national interest. And one of those is definitely not de-demonizing Japan. And it's become extremely difficult to handle these issues because of that problem. So to me, that's at the sort of the core of the security dilemma in the Western Pacific. And the real question then becomes, what do you do about it? And this gets to Henry's immediate question, which is, there's a lot of different things that you can talk about that the U.S. and China could do that would be sort of reciprocal actions of reassurance. And like Lyle Goldstein, some of you may have heard, just spoke yesterday at the SAIS China Forum about the China strategy in the South China Sea. And he ends his presentation, which I've seen before, with a whole set of interactive actions that could be taken by the claimants and the U.S. and China in dealing with that issue that would defuse the level of suspicion that exists over this. And they all are fairly doable. But it would require a certain understanding about a quid pro quo. There are people in the U.S. government that believe that quid pro quos with China that are directly related and have to do with security competition don't work. And they don't work because if you give China something, the view is, it will take it, pocket it, explain why it can't reciprocate, and move on. And that could be right or that could be wrong. But having that perception, particularly among people who are in the government, in looking at China, is not useful. So you have to, first of all, get to a point where you can actually have a credible engagement where people do believe and are going to put forward certain actions in response to other actions. But more important than that, and I'll end on this, is I don't think this problem of U.S.-China relations and what to do about U.S.-China relations is a bilateral problem. It's at the very least, it's a regional problem. And it has to do with developing a regional strategy. And Mike referred to this. A strategy that goes beyond where we are today, that looks 15, 20 years down the road, and sees the real possibility of a change in capabilities between China and the U.S. in relative terms, and changing capabilities and views among allies and friends. And you say to that, is our current strategy the best we can have to deal with that kind of future? And my answer to that would be no. But that's where I think the most important thing has to be a serious assessment about where we're going in the region and what we want the region to be over time.
Okay, we'll shake up the order a little bit. Dan, why don't you go next? And Michael, think about what specifically can we do to move in that direction or to create that common look at alternatives, opening up alternatives 20 years down the line. We do that through Track 2, we do that through informal study groups, we do that through scholarly activities.
So the question you want us to answer is what can the U.S. do about solving some of these?
Or if you want to you want to tell China what to do, you can do that too.
No, I certainly don't. I don't want to do that. First, I know Aaron Friedberg. I'm friends with Aaron Friedberg. Now, it's not that you're no Aaron Friedberg, but you got it a little bit wrong and a little bit exaggerated there. And I think Mike was getting to this too. It's that the U.S. needs primacy now because of to serve its interests in the kind of order that it created in order to get those three or four things that I said: maximum wealth, maximum security, maximum autonomy, maximum liberty, because it has no equivalent of the UK or Lord Palmerston, or let's flip this around. It has no one waiting in the wings to hand over the keys to, who shares the same vision of world order. And that's Aaron. Aaron has a lot of different arguments in the book, but I think Mike and I would agree, and same with Aaron, that there's a lot of power struggles. But at the end of the day, for this to end well, the U.S. has to trust that internal to China is a system that actually accepts the rules we died for, we spent treasure in, we bled for, and so on and so forth. So I think that's the Aaron Friedberg view. I would second that view. And I think also Mike was getting at that as well. But for now, we don't have a country like that. So we, in my view, I agree with Mike Swain on this, we need preeminence for the time being.
I didn't say we need preeminence. I said that's what we want.
Okay. I'm not sure the distinction, but anyway, so then what do we do? What can we do? Okay, so I come at it from the perspective of we clash in interests, and we clash in ideologies, not in the sense that we clash with the Soviets. The Chinese are not trying to spread a certain kind of ideology. It's more trying to defensively keep a one-party state, to use Shen Dongli's characterization, in power in a world more hostile than it once was to one-party states. That's not, you can, that's, so it's an ideology of power, it's an ideology of victimhood. It's different than ours in some sense. Maybe it's not perceived to be different, but it's different from ours in some sense. So I also came up at DOD at a time where two things were going on that were very different than now. One was I was still reading things about China's power that was belittling them. The million-man swim across Taiwan, China's hollow military. This was just 11 years ago. And now we're talking about China in a very different way, I should say. I also came up through DOD during the time where we tried a lot of cooperative activities with China, very serious ones. North Korea was supposed to be the one problem that we were going to solve together. Henry Kissinger said that there is no way that the U.S. and China working together cannot solve the North Korea problem. Guess what? We didn't. Iran was supposed to be another one. Guess what? We didn't. We had a lot of real confidence building measure proposals, real attempts to exchange dialogue on things that are on strategic nuclear forces and on cyber security and so on, all rejected for various reasons. And part of that is my own read, is China's, the tension in China between wanting to say they're a great power and the tension between China saying we're not a great power, we're weak, we don't have anything, and the decision was never made. Direct links in terms of being able to have hotlines and so forth, rejected. Maritime protocols that were set up in the late 90s in order to deal with just the kind of crises that when I came into the Pentagon happened, the EP3 incident, completely rejected when the EP3 happened. No protocol was followed. Jiang Zemin couldn't be found. I think he was in Latin America. So I am very skeptical that we can cooperate on any security issue at all. So I would take that off the table. What I do think is that we can cooperate a lot on economic issues because both of our countries have economic models that are not sustainable. China's economic model, when it comes to export-led growth and all the different kinds of currency issues that need to sustain export-led growth, China's capital controls, China's basically 1970s flying geese approach to economics that works so well for Taiwan and Japan and South Korea isn't sustainable because there's no demand in the world. The U.S. is not sustainable for obvious reasons. We're running unbelievable levels of debt. So I think that there's a lot of mutual interest in both of our economy or economic models changing, and that's where I would focus most of my efforts. I would keep pressing on managing this strategic competition in ways that don't lead to conflict. So I would keep pressing on the issues that are core to us, such as rules of the road in very destabilizing areas like nuclear forces and cyber. I would keep pressing on things like hotlines and maritime protocols. I wouldn't give up because it's so important to avoid conflict. I would recognize there's a competition. I wouldn't do what Congresswoman Harman said and not mention China in terms of a rebalancing strategy. The Chinese don't believe it's not about them. The American public won't be with us if we just kind of abstractly, in an airy-fairy way say, well, we're just rebalancing because, we're rebalancing. So we're not going to get the resources either in foreign aid or elsewhere to actually accomplish a rebalancing. It happens to be untrue. So, and China, can be very clear, which I appreciate, about their perception of threat from us. So I think we should acknowledge that competition and find ways to manage it.
Okay. Just as skeptical?
Just as skeptical in a somewhat different way. I think that it's not possible to end the strategic dilemma, the security dilemma. We can take the rough edges off through greater transparency on both sides and more subtle diplomacy, more cautious diplomacy on both sides. But there is an underlying dynamic here that I don't think can be avoided. George W. Bush, in his 2000 election campaign, I think got the U.S.-China relationship exactly right. One of the very few things he got right in his entire presidency. And that was that China and the United States, yes, China and the United States are strategic competitors. That's what he said, and that was a term, in fact, that I had used a few years earlier. And I think that captures the relationship quite well. Competitors also cooperate on a good many occasions. Even vigorous economic competitors are often members of trade associations, for example. The Chamber of Commerce incorporates a good many hard-driving competitors in the business world. And I think that's the relationship that we have with China. There is a competitive aspect to this relationship. There's also a cooperative aspect. But as time passes, I think the competitive part is likely to become a bit more important. The cooperative aspect, unfortunately, a bit less. What we have with a dynamic here is something we have seen many times before in history, a rising great power confronting an incumbent hegemonic power. We talked briefly on the panel here about one of those instances, the rise of the United States and Great Britain's reaction to that. But there were others that took place roughly during that same historical period, the rise of Imperial Germany and the relationship with Great Britain. A little later, the rise of Imperial Japan and the relationship with the United States. And I would point out that two of those three dyads, the situation did not turn out well at all. So this requires very careful management. If you want to go back further in history, that matter, the rise of Rome versus the incumbent leading power of that day, Carthage, that didn't turn out well either. So this is a development that is fraught with a good deal of risk and danger if it is not managed carefully. The UK-US dynamic turned out well when Great Britain basically relinquished its leading position in the Western Hemisphere and turned it over to the United States. That was difficult to do, even though both of them shared, to a wide extent, cultural and political values. It is much, much more difficult to make that kind of adjustment when the social and political systems are very, very different. And that is, of course, the situation we have between the United States and China. There's a question of whatever the United States wants to do in terms of maintaining its dominance in East Asia. Can it do so over the longer term at a reasonable level of cost and risk? And I think there's a great deal of doubt about that. And if we cannot do so, what is our second best option? Is it trying to fight to the bitter end to prevent China's rise to being the leading power in East Asia? Or can we accept that if China is merely the leading power in East Asia, but not the hegemonic power in that region? There is a distinction there, and I think it's one we need to look at in a very serious fashion. The United States also, and I think we're probably going to get into this in the final minutes, has to set priorities, and this is something our policymakers are either incapable or unwilling to do. If East Asia is our most important region, strategically and economically, then we need to focus our attention on that region. And I think we certainly can maintain our preeminent position for at least a period of time, perhaps even 2 or 3 decades yet. But not if we're running massive federal budget deficits and trying to be the dominant power in Europe, the dominant power in the Middle East, the dominant power in Central Asia, and probably the dominant power in Antarctica. The United States needs to set priorities, and our leaders are singularly unwilling to face that requirement. The relationship with China is going to be a delicate one, even under the best of circumstances. We have crucial economic ties, and thank God for that, because if we did not have that, our dynamic would be awfully similar to what we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and that would be catastrophic for both sides. That economic relationship is the cooperative part of the relationship. That's the main part of that cooperative element. And that needs to be strengthened and maintained as much as possible. But I want to emphasize again, I don't think that's sufficient. There are other aspects here that are going to produce very serious tensions in the coming decades. That's unavoidable. How we manage those tensions is going to be the crucial test.
Mike, can you pick us up a little bit? First of all, I mean, I hope you see that we have picked a panel with a few differences. That's what we were trying to do. Mike?
Let me try to answer the first question, which is what should we do about the security dilemma? And second, I want to touch on this issue of the maritime disputes or the first island chain, which I think is the core problem we have to think through. What should we do? I hate it when people say this in conferences, but I'm going to say it. We have to get our own quote-unquote act together. And I'm confident we can do it, our politics notwithstanding. We will be the world's largest oil exporter in 2020. Innovation will remain an American domain. We heard this morning Chinese leaders want to send their kids to American universities. The top 17 of the world's top 20 universities are American. Things like that are incredible assets. God has looked kindly upon this dysfunctional country in many ways, and I think we have the ability to get on track, a strong recovery. I think that's the most important thing, because I think, although I was disparaging structural realism earlier, I think the core of the problem, I use the word core too much, I think the problem we have is almost all derivative of the shaking of the distribution of power in the international system. And if the democratic model and the capitalist economic model, which is in trouble in Japan, Europe, and the US, is proven to be enduring, that will have a huge impact, I believe, on Chinese strategic assumptions, on everyone's strategic assumptions. Now, I don't subscribe to the view that we need to pull back from the world while we fix our economic problems. It's a little bit like getting in a knife fight and saying, hold on, I'm going to go work out for 6 months, wait right here. The world moves on. And so I think it's precisely at a time like this that we need deft diplomacy. Smart balance of power strategies, smart reassurance strategies. We should be picking up our game, not making the case to the American people that now's the time to pull back. I think that therefore there are things we could be doing now. One is consistency. George W. Bush did get China policy right. I think most scholars on the left, right, and center have acknowledged that. And one reason he got it right was because he was consistent. He was able to say democracy in Taiwan, democracy in Japan is the future of Asian order, and then go the next day to China and have a good summit meeting with Hu Jintao. The reason was because at the end of the day, I think the Chinese leaders believed George W. Bush, like his father, was committed to improving the U.S.-China relationship. And because he was candid. And I was very struck when the Obama administration came in that we had this three-character phrase we would use publicly and privately in describing U.S.-China relations: comprehensive, cooperative, and candid. And the Obama administration dropped the candid and added positive. And I think in a way they were lying to themselves and to our Chinese colleagues. And I think the candid element can and should be there, but you have to be consistent about our interest in our principles and the intention to keep doing what every president since Richard M. Nixon has tried to do, which is bring U.S.-China relations up to the next level. I carried a letter from President Bush to Hu Jintao in February or late January 2005 after the inauguration. I was just a messenger. I was supposed to give it to the deputy foreign minister. The Chinese government took me in to see Hu Jintao personally to give the letter. We interpreted that as being a signal from Beijing that the U.S. relationship and the President of China's personal relationship with the U.S. president was still the cornerstone of China's foreign policy. And the president's letter said, we want to take U.S.-China relations to the next level in my second term. And I think you can be candid about where you disagree, but I think that commitment is critical. And I don't think President Obama has successfully conveyed that, and I think he sent mixed messages, as I was saying earlier. So consistency is key. I don't completely agree with Dan that cooperation on security projects is off the table. Yes, it didn't work out great with Iran, didn't work out great with Korea, but I think we need projects. I think we need things we do together. Counter-piracy could be one. I think Burma is one. I think Burma has been cast as a locus of U.S.-China competition, and that's wrong. I think we actually have common interests in many ways in Burma. Some will be small, some will be big. I'm not a big believer that mechanisms will work in the short term. Hotlines, CBMs, they didn't work in the EP3. We had all sorts of mechanisms. None of them worked. I think what matters is a level of personal trust between leaders, between military commanders, between diplomats. It's the personalities and the personal trust that you have to invest in. The mechanisms only work. Jiang Zemin would not pick up the phone. President Bush called a dozen times in the EP3 incident. We had the technical means, we had the hotline, we had everything. You need the personal trust between the leaders. That's critical. And let me just briefly, if I can, on the South China Sea, Senkaku, East China Sea, I do not see these as, they are about fish, it's about nationalism, it's about natural gas. But I believe that these disputes are all about a geostrategic struggle for control of a absolutely critical geostrategic line, which is the first island chain and the waters around it, that has deep history in Chinese thinking, American thinking, Japanese thinking. And it will be very hard to manage because no matter what we do in the diplomacy, the order of battle, the number of ships, Japanese, Chinese, is going to keep growing, and the operational tempo is rising. I do think there is a contradiction in China's approach. I think if you sort of get past the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and multipolarity and a lot of the surface of Chinese foreign policy doctrine, I think Beijing is basically pursuing 2 strategic lines of effort with respect to the first island chain that are contradictory. Number one, since the Taiwan crisis in 1995-96, I think China has pursued what Michael called a counter-intervention strategy, to impose a cost on the U.S. or to dissuade or deter the U.S. from thinking it can insert forces in a crisis in this island chain. It may be for completely legitimate defensive reasons. It can be that and also be threatening. But the other, and of course, what does that involve? Well, the Senkakus, the Scarborough Shoals, all of these things are derivative of that. They're not just about fish and nationalism. The other strategic line, which I think is completely contradictory, is I think China is pursuing a strategy of counter-containment, that Beijing very much is employing different instruments of power, diplomacy, soft power, trade, the whole gamut, to prevent the alignment of countries against China under the U.S. or the U.S. and Japan to prevent China's rise. The irony or the contradiction is the more China pursues counter-intervention strategy, the more it fuels containment. As Joe and I likes to say, the only country that can contain China is China. I have some hope that in Beijing there will be a recognition of this contradiction. And I don't think, that's why I think the U.S. has to be very consistent, and that Secretary Clinton has been right on target about our interests in freedom of navigation, our treaty commitments to allies like Japan. These countries don't want to contain China. They don't want to have to choose. But China's counter-intervention strategy could force decisions by states that are not in China's interests in terms of counter-containment. And that, in the end, may sort of regulate or limit how much competition there is. Personally, I don't think in Beijing there's a full recognition of this yet, though.
Terrific. All right, wonderful. We got 10 minutes left for my other two questions. No, we'll kind of fold them into one here, and it has to do with the connection between sort of the security discussions and the economic relationships. Since the end of the Cold War, it seems to me the glue, by the way, of the relationship in the Cold War was the Soviet Union, right? Since the end of the Cold War, the glue has been essentially the integration of the two countries in the global economy. Now, the question is, as we try to step up the security cooperation in order to deal with all of these security dilemmas that we've talked about, or all of these issues that are a consequence of the security dilemma, what chance do we have if, in fact, the economic game, that is, the commitments that we have followed through on and that have led to the enormously successful economic relationship and progress that both countries have made and that the region has made, if that comes to an end, if that game begins to unravel, it's been the glue holding together, it seems to me, the containment engagement strategy, or whatever you want to call it. It's been the glue holding it together since the end of the Cold War. It may be weakening. If it is, what chance then do we have to escalate security cooperation when the economic game, as I say, is sort of falling apart? This is complicated or compounded by the resource issue that I mentioned domestically, where we're both facing situations of dwindling resources to bring to bear to our particular interests abroad. So I know you can't answer all of that in 2 minutes each, but can you kind of hit one point? And Ted, we'll start with you, just to vary the, and go to Mike, and then Dan, and finally we'll wind up with Michael. And just hit one point to set it up.
Yeah, the nexus between security and economics, I think, is perhaps a little underappreciated in the debate, at least in the United States. And that is China's rise as a major economic power, but an economic power that has some significant vulnerabilities, some significant dependencies. The discussion that occurred this morning about China's growing need for energy and the fact that Iran provides a rather high percentage of China's energy needs in the form of exports to China. That means that China has an energy lifeline that is rather long, that runs to the Middle East, to the Persian Gulf region. And one has to ask how long it's going to be before China will want the air and naval capabilities to protect that lifeline unilaterally. Right now, it has to depend on the goodwill of the United States and its allies to keep those shipping lanes open and to protect that lifeline. If there is an abundance of trust between Beijing and Washington, that's a vulnerability, but it's a manageable vulnerability for China. If that trust breaks down, whether that's because of trade tensions, whether that's because of security tensions elsewhere in the world, especially the maritime issues in the extreme Western Pacific, and that trust is likely to erode as well, creating a much greater incentive for China to build up, to a greater extent, its air and naval capabilities, which in turn, I will guarantee you, the United States would regard as deeply worrisome, if not threatening. This is how a security dilemma can, despite the intentions of both sides, begin to grow.
Mike.
In 1928, Thomas P. Lamont, the president of J.P. Morgan and a very influential foreign policy figure at the time, gave a speech saying war with Japan was 100% impossible because of financial interdependence. Oops. And you all know the famous Norman Angell anecdote. So, the economic factors are very determinative. The health of the global economy, the health of capitalism in the U.S., Europe, Japan will have an important effect. But Europe's democracy, Japan's democracy, the U.S. democracy will survive. The real impact at the end of the day that matters most is how a financial crisis, a major crisis, impacts rising states or transitional states where the regime type is more vulnerable. And I did a study on this, which for the Aspen Strategy Group, if you're interested, and found historically there are basically two paths if there's a change that a country can take. It's a little like Woody Allen's famous graduation speech where he said, "Students, you face two paths. One is complete nihilism and a meaningless existence. The other, total nuclear annihilation." It's a little better than that. So one historical pattern, and of course history rhymes, it doesn't repeat. One historical, the good news historical pattern is the impact of an economic crisis on a country like Indonesia or Korea in the 1990s or Brazil in the 1980s, where you had authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian regimes that lost legitimacy because of a financial crisis and democratized. That's what happened in Brazil, Korea, and Indonesia in different ways. The other model, the other path, is Weimar Germany and Taisho-era Japan. Someone mentioned earlier Japan was a revisionist power. Japan was not a revisionist power in the 1920s. Japan became a revisionist power because we didn't keep our deterrence up, because we forgot about balance of power, and because the international economic system, crashed and the British power declined quickly, and there were internal drivers in Japan, of course, and within the region. But Japan became a revisionist power. So the negative path is the impact of a financial crisis on a authoritarian but quasi-democratic. Japan had two-party systems. The Germans had democratic elections. So those are sort of the two historical paths. I think, I'm on the optimistic side in a way. I think that, personally, that China's economic growth in the future is highly dependent on what some of the speakers said this morning, fighting corruption, accountability, transparency. And in the end, those will have a very positive effect on gradual liberalization within China. Sudden democratization, as we saw in Taisho, Japan, is not necessarily good, or in Iraq or elsewhere. But I think that the economic choices China faces, if met with the right answers, will lead to exactly the kind of accountability, transparency, rule of law, intellectual property rights that would sustain growth, get China out of the middle income gap, that will have a positive effect on political liberalization within China. So I'm basically optimistic, but history suggests, and Ted had his, we're 1 for 3 on rising powers. So history suggests you got to be a little nervous.
All right, Dan?
Yeah, can I ask you to not repeat the question, but what haven't you heard? There was a big question, so what would you like to hear more of?
Basically, can we sustain the bargain that we've had since the end of the Cold War to continue our interdependence, that is, and generate the resources that we need in order to grow and in order to deal with other problems, while we increasingly encounter these security problems from rising capabilities?
The short answer is I choose nihilism over nuclear. The short answer is no, we can't, precisely because of this issue of, so the great bargain I think you're referring to is that we would essentially provide the global public goods as the global hegemon, which we did, not always to the liking of everybody, but to the liking of enough people. And in the case of Asia, we provided security and a security umbrella so that countries could focus on economic and political development, and in many cases political liberalization. That was the bargain. And implicit in that bargain was actually bargaining for our relative decline because those powers would grow and we'd have to take more responsibility. So if China, I guess, believed that that's a set of global responsibilities that they themselves wanted to take up because we can no longer do so, that would be one matter. But in the words of Ted, it's unlikely right now because of. It's even difficult when you're making that transition, when you share political and cultural values. It's a lot more difficult if you don't, and maybe even impossible, to get into that virtuous cycle that Mike was describing. And I agree with Mike, and which is why I would like to, focus a relationship on economic reform. I think you can get into a virtuous cycle where China liberalizes, the U.S. shows that it trusts itself more, China liberalizes itself. It's a very gradual process, but it's a virtuous cycle. But if no one's upholding, somebody has to do the work of the hegemon in an international system. I mean, sea lanes don't get. We tried other ways before World War I. We tried other ways before World War II. If nobody is in the end providing security, if no one in the end is the security provider of last resort, if nobody in the end is providing leadership on trade and trade liberalization, nobody. It's just not going to. It's going to be something more like the Dark Ages than anything we've seen right now. It doesn't happen. Peace doesn't enforce itself, and a liberal international order doesn't enforce itself. So I guess my short answer to your question is no.
All right, Michael, last word. On that note.
Make you happy.
Yeah. I don't sort of see the world in quite the way that Dan does. I don't think it's necessarily a foregone conclusion, but this is at the core of many of these issues, as we've discussed, that there has to be a single global hegemon that provides for the public good. If you believe people like Peter Katzenstein and others, you look at the world today as being actually in many ways significantly different from what it was in the first half of the 20th century, that there is no alternative to more common ways of providing for the common good, that one power doing so will probably not be able to do so, and that you don't necessarily need to have one power to do so. There was a very interesting assessment. I was at a conference at the Naval War College not too long ago by one of their analysts who looked at the change in maritime power globally out many years. And he made for the Naval War College, revolutionary argument that naval power can no longer be seen as serving the interests of one naval power by a particular country serving that country's interests against the possibility of other naval powers that might threaten it.
He's now at the Air Force Academy.
He's still there. He's still there. And he emphasized that there has to be a much more, he said the world is now becoming so networked. And in the maritime area, this is very much the case, that navies have to really try to build on the ability of navies to interact in providing for many common things. So getting back to the issue of economics, for me, economics in terms of global economic change, and what Henry asked about the U.S.-China relationship in that global economic change, I can't see of many scenarios where the U.S. or China would adopt a policy sufficiently grave enough and sufficiently conflictual enough that economic issues themselves would be an independent variable that would drive the U.S. and China into confrontation or conflict. Very hard to see that happening. Now, you can posit it under certain conditions if you had a really strong protectionist type leadership that goes way beyond just simple trade protectionism here and there, that has a mercantilist view of the world and believes you have to capture parts of the world and actually hold them under your control, a very 19th century concept, or early 20th century, to prosper. I mean, theoretically, that kind of a leadership could emerge, I suppose, but the disadvantages to doing that are so enormous that it's hard for me to see how it could happen. Now, another way where, though, you could get something is the so-called very famous argument about diversionary war. I don't know how many of you have heard about it. It's a very political science phrase. And that is that if the economy gets bad enough in a country, and they often apply this to China, if it gets bad enough, if it becomes unstable enough, the leadership will look for foreign adventures to unify the population. It will engage in nationalistic, jingoistic saber rattling in order to mollify the unrest within the society and distract them from their domestic problems. I see that also, again, in the modern context and in the Chinese context in particular, as being highly unlikely. It certainly is not supported by the historical record. Historically, when China has had big problems internally, it has sought to try and mollify the outside world so that it could deal with its internal problems, unless it saw the outside world as directly contributing to those problems. And of course, that's the big catch if you see that. Some Chinese leaders, I think, have a propensity to do that. They look at the outside world and say, there must be a foreign hand behind this. That's what's causing our problems. But to say that and to go from that to we need a war to strengthen our position is a huge leap. So what are you left with on the economic side? Well, I think you're left with an environment where the two sides have to seriously manage in a much larger environment, not your bilateral environment, a whole host of economic issues that they all share in. And I guess I agree with Katzenstein that I don't see the Chinese fundamentally questioning the underlying dynamics of the liberal international order, what's called the liberal international economic order. It serves their interests way too much. And the arguments are on the margins about certain types of behaviors that are or are not conducive to that order, but not, we don't want that order, we want something else. I think it's very unlikely we're going to see that. And if we don't see that, then we're left with managing the economic problems. And there, it'll go up and down based on other variables, not economic ones necessarily. So the economic situation to me is not as big of a driver behind contention in the U.S.-China relationship as I think some people think.
Terrific.
That's optimistic, isn't it?
Michael, thank you very much. I heard a lot of echoes there, liberal international economic order. I liked it, as opposed to other scenarios that would project, of course,
and could I just
stronger protectionism.
One last word?
Yes.
I don't believe the U.S. policy, and I'm not sitting here as a spokesman of the U.S. government, heaven forbid. The U.S. government is not engaged in what you would call a classic policy of containment towards China. I think most people understand that. And I don't think Dan necessarily meant that. Maybe you did. But I really think the U.S. is not engaged in a containment policy. And if it were, we would see a very different world.
I didn't say. I said it's impossible if you have a country that's not autarkic and you don't have common. It's impossible to do that kind of containment.
It's also in a context, you see, in which we have this enormous economic interdependence. Yeah. I think that's the key.
It's possible because of that.
Yeah. Well, I have only one regret for this panel. We went over a little bit, that's one, but the other one, no, I have two. I don't think we gave you enough to react to. Or I think our next panel has plenty to react to, and we'll come back at 3:30, so grab some coffee, and we'll see you then.